Hello everyone and welcome. Today we are meeting on the land of the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and pay respect to them as the traditional owners, their continuing culture and the contribution to the life of this city and region. We also acknowledge the owners and elders past, present and emerging throughout Australia as the traditional owners of the lands from where so many people are joining us today, and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who may be attending today's event. My name is Jazz Chambers and I'm delighted to be chairing our meeting today, and I welcome you on behalf of myself, Karen Evans and Kim Picard. We would like to extend our thanks to our friends here at Questacon, the National Science and Technology Centre, to Graham Durant, Bobby Serini, Lauren Ambrose and colleagues who have been so genuinely interested and generous in their support. We have hundreds of people joining us from across Australia, and we thank you for the gift of your time and attention. Some of you are returning for this second briefing, and for some it will be your first. We're on something of an odyssey together as we seek to engage Australia's ocean stakeholders, which, let's face it, is everyone. In our first briefing, we traversed the question, what does success look like to the ocean stakeholders? The Ocean Decade Framework outlines 7 outcomes. A clean ocean, a healthy and resilient ocean, a productive, predicted, safe, accessible, inspiring and engaging ocean. We put that question back to you, today's participants, and asked you to prioritise. Overwhelmingly, those participating from around Australia today selected a healthy and resilient ocean. But how would we measure that? From our previous feedback, we also distilled responses into the following ideas. It's a lot of words on that slide. We then asked you, our participants today, to tell us which of these ideas you thought would lead to the greatest success for Australia. It would seem that having a plan, a framework, evidence-based decision-making and equitable and future-thinking outcomes is highly desirable. Come on in, everyone. In addition, valuing our marine ecosystems and the human impact on them being understood and reflected in policy is also important. Today we're going to delve into all of these ideas through both our interview session and our panel as we discuss measurement. Some of you might know that I love a thought experiment. So, close your eyes. Just do it. It's okay. Can you take yourself back to that moment you realised the ocean was a life-changing force in your life? That you had a connection to it that was unexplainable? I've tried to do that, and I think I've pinpointed a moment at around 10 years old on Cronulla Beach with my pop. We were looking out at the surf and I asked him what was under it all. My pop said he didn't know, but he had read that most of the living space on Earth by volume was underneath it. My pop was an accounting academic, so numbers and measurement were an important thing. And I think that was the moment that I was hooked, that if most of the living space on Earth was something I couldn't even see, then that was something I would be forever curious about. And so it has been for me. We all have those first moment stories. They're pretty emotional, and I encourage you to tell them. Since our first briefing, the outcomes of the first endorsed decade actions was announced 2 weeks ago, and we congratulate Piping Hot Australia, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and the Minderoo Foundation for successful endorsement of decade actions. There are also many global initiatives that Australian organisations and agencies are involved in. To those contributors, again, congratulations. This is a very strong first showing of Australian leadership in the decade. What we think is demonstrated through the decade process is the inclusive culture that we touched upon in our first briefing. We've got a fashion label, a business, foundations, science, research and government organisations, all in the mix of contributors. And we know that there will be many more actions to come, from community groups through to individuals. We're committed to bringing in all views from across those stakeholders. No one group owns the ocean, but we do all own the responsibility for its future. All voices, young, old, experienced, novice, scientific, artistic, profit-making and purpose-driven, must be listened to. Since we started talking to people about the decade earlier this year, we've interviewed and talked with over 120 individuals outside of these briefings and interacted with hundreds more on social media and via email. There's such great hope from these conversations because everyone, and I mean everyone, wants to do things better and all believe we can. So let's have high expectations for what can be achieved. I'd now like to introduce the Director of the National Science and Technology Centre, Professor Graham Durant, AM, our generous host for today's meeting, to formally welcome us to this important national treasure, Questacon. Graham.
Yuma, welcome to Questacon, and we're delighted to be hosting this today. I love the oceans. I'm never happier when I'm on the sea in my kayak, or underwater, or walking along the beach looking at the waves. And my love relationship with the ocean, prompted by Jaz's question, started in 1973. And in 1973, I was standing in a telephone box on the Scottish island of Islay, and the box was swaying wildly back and forth, except it wasn't, and it was my body that was going back and forth and my balance system, because I just spent 4 weeks at sea on a small research vessel, just starting my PhD as a marine geologist. And during that first cruise, getting away from the land onto the ocean was just such a remarkable experience. And even though I discovered I was a terrible sailor and horribly seasick, nevertheless, it stuck with me. The work I was doing was on the continental shelf of Scotland, an underwater volcanic complex, 55 million years old, so looking at the root zones of the volcano. And we were doing geophysical work and survey work, and I had to learn to dive to go down and collect rocks. So the following year, during our diving training, I was drifting around with a colleague for about 2 hours in the Irish Sea because our boat, the engine had packed up. And we were going across fast current. It was late afternoon, getting dark. We were alone in the ocean. The guys in the boat tried to set off a flare, which fell apart in their hand. Unfortunately, they managed to rebuild it, set it off, and somebody fortunately saw it. And, quite a while later, the lifeboat came out and was going back and forth looking for us. So, it's a pretty epic way to fall in love with the ocean. And then the following year, again, doing geophysical work, we were running in front of a Storm 12 in the Malin Sea. Now, Storm 12 waves are pretty big. I mean, the Southern Ocean gives us a good example of what that is. And in the North Atlantic, it's also pretty horrible. And this boat was corkscrewing along. And, so I've had some of the worst times of my life and some of the absolute best times of my life on the ocean. In a previous world as an academic, I used to lecture in marine geology, and I was fortunate to be speaking at the time of these remarkable discoveries of deep sea vents and whole new communities on the mid-ocean ridge that Project Famous discovered. The time that the deep sea drilling program was taking samples that unlocked the history of the ocean basins. So it was a time of great excitement in the ocean realm. And it's not stopped, it's going on. The technology is now just so remarkable that we're in a position where we can study things in a way we couldn't before. When we were doing my PhD, I learned that if you're doing echo-sounding survey of the bathymetry and you're going along at 30 knots into a current of 30 knots, you build an enormous big plateau on your echo sounder trace. Fundamental thing like that. And I thought we'd discovered this enormous plateau. And of course, we were just pinging the same spot for about half an hour. Anyway, moving on, I've been lucky enough to dive in Iceland around some of the volcanic vents there, and with killer whales in the water and a totally black substrate in a totally dark environment. But you can counter that with some of the wonderful dives in the ocean waters on the Scottish shelf. So you get that mix of inshore waters which are a bit gloopy, and then every now and again the ocean waters come in and they're crystal clear, and it really is God's own country. In Australia, I've got the pleasure of being here at Questacon, but I've not lost my love of the oceans. When we did the Inspiring Australia report in 2012, we chose marine science as a topic. We wanted to do a particular subject to go deep to see how we might be able to communicate science better. And looking at the recommendations then, developing a national approach to marine science communication, bringing marine science into the community, getting marine science into the media, using marine science to inform national and international policy, putting marine science to work, and showcasing Australia's marine science. We've got work to do. We're not there yet, and the decade gives us a real chance to get ahead of the game, to tell those stories, to make a difference. You have to measure what you value and value what you measure. So today is all about working out what we want to measure. How will we know we've made a difference? What difference do we want to make? So it's a really important time for all of us to work together. We're sitting here in the Japan theatre, and I was looking at the Japan publication and what they're hoping to do in the decade, and they've sort of got it together and tabulated it, and in spite of all the good work we're doing, we've got a bit more to do to pull it all together, and I'm pleased that we're starting to do that. We've got every bit of bigger story to tell as Japan, and we should be doing it loud and proud. And I'm hoping that this initiative that Karen, Kim and Jazz have put together will flourish, and that we'll all work together to position Australia as a key player in the marine realm in the context of the world. So thank you for your interest. Thank you to all those online listening in, and hopefully you'll all contribute. So I'll hand back to Jazz now.
Thank you, Graham. My name's Karen Evans. I'm one of the 3 organisers of today and also of the previous briefing. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to Questacon and to all of our panel members and interview members who have graciously volunteered their time today, and would also like to thank you for all coming along or joining in online. At our last briefing, we introduced a number of international initiatives that really are aiming to achieve a sustainable future, not only for our planet, but especially for our oceans. And that includes the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, around which we framed both that briefing and this briefing. Over the last year, we have seen a number of initiatives released, identifying commitments, recommendations and ongoing plans for Australia in achieving a sustainable future for our ocean and coasts. This includes the commitments made by the Prime Minister as a member of the 14-nation high-level panel, the recommendations made in a strategy developed by Future Earth Australia for our ocean and coasts, and progress and future plans for Australia's National Marine Science Plan, put together by Australia's National Marine Science Committee, which represents research agencies, government institutions and government agencies, with a focus around the fundamental science that we need for a sustainable future. This next session will delve into each of these initiatives in a bit more depth, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Tony Warby, who is CEO of Flourishing Oceans at Minderoo Foundation, to guide this conversation. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks firstly to Jazz and Karen and Kim for all of their organising of today. They're doing just a fantastic job of bringing the UN Decade to life here in Australia, and also to Graham, thanks so much for your warm welcome to Questacon. Great to see so many people here in the audience. I know lots of people have been stuck in various places around the country, but to those of you online, thanks so much for joining us. As Karen just mentioned, we're in quite a unique position, I think. Here we are at the start of the UN Decade for the oceans, and we have 3 major activities and reports that are very forward-looking. They're full of great recommendations and strategies for the priorities for the ocean, for both marine science and all of the other ocean stakeholders around the country. They've really done a huge amount of work to consult broadly to bring different stakeholder groups into those discussions, and their recommendations in these reports really reflect this. And really, you know, when you look at these documents, the amount of work and effort that's gone into them is extraordinary. And what we're trying to do in this session this morning is really to paint a picture of how they all come together and set us up to really galvanise all of the efforts of ocean stakeholders around the country and globally for that matter over the next few years. We have three speakers on the panel today. Dr. Russell Reichelt, known to many of you, long and distinguished career in marine science, and today is speaking about his role on the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean, on which he represents Australia's Prime Minister. We have Tiana O'Donnell, who is the CEO of Future Earth Australia, and in introducing Tiana, I'd also like to acknowledge Taryn Laubenstein, who's in the audience here today and did a lot of the writing for the report, and Patrick Hone, who is the CEO of Fisheries Research and Development Corporation in his day job, but sits on the panel today as a representative of Australia's National Marine Science Committee. So, I might just start by asking each of the three speakers to give a couple of minutes of background to really paint the picture of the initiative that they're involved in, and a little bit of its background, what that's trying to achieve, and who the key stakeholders and objectives are. So, Russell, great to have you online, all the way from sunny Queensland, I think. So I'll throw to you first.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to the organisers as well, and everyone who's out there virtually or in the room. Look, the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, which is a mouthful, I'll admit, was an initiative by... And the 14 countries are distributed globally. They all have significant ocean estates, exclusive economic zones. And there's a balance in the group of 14 leaders between developing and developed countries. The thing that I wanted to point to is why did they come together? And it was a recognition that they are there as individual leaders, the sitting heads of government. It's not a UN body. They weren't writing a treaty or a convention. They had a common purpose in that there's a passion amongst our leaders, and that came out when the Prime Minister launched the transformations for a sustainable ocean economy with Minister Susan Lee in December last year, and it really is the word transformations wasn't chosen lightly. It's a recognition of the need for strong action if we're going to balance the needs of people, the planet and prosperity to create a sustainable ocean economy. And underpinning the concept of this rapid move to a sustainable ocean economy is that you cannot have such a thing as a sustainable ocean economy without first ensuring you have a healthy ocean. And our Prime Minister mentioned it, as did Minister Lee. It's embedded deeply into the document whose cover you can see on the screen. I recommend it to you at oceanpanel.org. So that's the big picture. But the other attributes of this release, the transformations document, is that it has 5 pillars. They're on the screen as well. So there's ocean health, wealth, equity, knowledge and finance, and perhaps I can talk more about those if time allows later. But essentially, the conversations began with looking at wealth and health, but quickly realised that fairness, ocean equity, ocean knowledge and information, science, evidence, and sustainable, innovative finance are very important. And just to give you a sense of the conversations, ocean equity, I would talk in the group about burgeoning aquaculture, offshore renewable energy, decarbonising shipping, for instance. And at one point, the representative from Kenya pulled me aside and just quietly said, Russell, when my Prime Minister talks about the ocean, he talks about poverty, he talks about hunger and anger. And so it taught me a lesson that everyone's perspective on the ocean is different. And you'll see expressions in that transformation document that the work should be done according to national circumstances, which vary a lot. And Tony, just to conclude the overview, I draw the group's attention to probably the headline commitment, which is the 14 leaders agreed that all members would have a sustainably managed, sustainable ocean economy by 2025, underpinned and guided by sustainable ocean plans. So that's by 2025, ahead of the Sustainable Development Goal milestone of 2030. So hopefully we will all be operating much more sustainably through transforming multiple sectors of the ocean economy, recognising the need for ocean health, healthy ocean, and the need for equity and fairness in the benefits flowing back to people. I'll stop there, Tony.
Great, thanks, Russell. And there's a few great points to pull out there, I think, in the conversation going forward. And the first, of course, is having political will, or working hard to ensure that you have the political will to put a sustainable ocean plan in place, is just so important. Tayana, can we move to you just to hear a little bit about the background of Future Earth Australia's work recently and the Oceans and Coasts strategy that's been developed?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much. So, for those who are wondering what a future Earth is, the answer to that, of course, is it's our Earth. Future Earth Australia is the Australian node of a global network of researchers and innovators working in the sustainability space. And sustainability, of course, is a very broad church, but we do look to the Sustainable Development Goals as our guiding light and in thinking about sustainability challenges, opportunities, and how we can get some traction at local scale right through to global and back again in implementing those by 2030. So it's a big remit and a big network. There's about 10,000 very active people across the network, but the network itself is broader than that globally. Here in Australia, we're hosted and based at the Australian Academy of Science, and our program really revolves around a number of different activities, one of which is to develop 10-year strategies on thematic issues to advance the sustainability agenda here in Australia. Our committee and governing council took the decision back in 2019, the years have blurred, to have 2020, 2021 focus for FEA, Future Earth Australia, to be on oceans and coasts. And that was quite deliberate. We deliberately put coasts and oceans together. And the reason we did that is because we work in a systemic way. We recognise that our oceans are interdependent and directly related to what we do on land, how ecosystems work with human systems, how technology works with economies, and so on. And so in developing our strategy, we coalesced a range of knowledge perspectives, scientific ones, yes, but also First Peoples knowledge perspectives, peak bodies, not-for-profit groups, the broader community right across the country to engage with us on what a 10-year strategy for Australia would look like, and critically how or what would be the pathways to implement the strategy, because there's, at least for coasts, there's been some 20 odd, maybe more, strategies to try and nationalise and make the planning for and the sustainability of those spaces a bit more efficient. And so we need the strategies, but we also need a very clear line of sight to the actions and the pathways to achieve them, because we're running out of time. You know, the SDGs 2030 feels far away. It's not. Russell's point about 2025 being the benchmark for the planning for the high-level panel is exciting, really exciting to see. That's not far away. That's 4 years is just around the corner. It's going to be here like that. And we're experiencing quite rapid and cascading changes in our Earth system, so we need to be really focused on those actions. So that was why we developed the strategy the way that we did. It makes 7 recommendations. They're very broad. The strategy is intended to be holistic. It's intended to be a living document. So while it's got some very clear roadmaps and pathways, it's also intended to evolve as we evolve and as Australians evolve towards the implementation, we hope, of the SDGs and other things.
And fair to say that it's a strategy that's been developed that everybody should own, in a sense, that it's not up to Future Earth Australia to deliver on this strategy now. It's very much about doing the stakeholder engagement and now putting it out and using it as a mechanism to galvanise action, to amplify messages, to encourage people to buy into. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, as a convening body and running a network here in Australia, we're very, very focused on how we can leverage our independence and the authority that we come to these things with to advance that change. So we won't do the strategy and leave it to sit on the shelf with all the other ones. We're very focused on working with everybody, because you're right, we're all stakeholders, to implement it.
Great, thanks. And Patrick, you're here representing the National Marine Science Committee, with which you've had a long association. Can you tell us, a little bit about the committee itself and the makeup of the committee and its national role, but also a little bit about the original plan and the update to the plan that's in the works?
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and just acknowledging the Ngunnawal people here today. Just a comment. First of all, we all have a love of oceans, and we already heard Graham and Karen and others and Jazz talk about their personal experience. We all have personal experiences. I'm not into that today, but I do sit here today with the National Marine Science Committee hat on. There are about 39 organisations in the National Marine Science Committee. We're growing all the time. And to say that we have an amazing marine science community in Australia is an understatement of the fact. We are incredibly fortunate. We sit here today to talk about the future in the 2030, and as scientists, we can do all the science in the world. If we don't have a strategy and don't have a vision, it'll be all for nothing. And so today we've heard Russell talk about that we are connected to the world. We actually have a world remit to do something. We now have a strategy that we all can own, and it's a really, really informed piece of work. And many of the people in this room and others who we're involved with have been part of that strategy development. So us in the National Marine Science Committee have been part of this conversation for a long time. We were in the Oceans Policy Science Advisory Group when we had the old Oceans Policy. So of course we welcome the high-level panel, Russell, and the development of a National Oceans Plan. In fact, that will give effect to what our science is all about. And that's so important, and we're going to talk about that today. The National Marine Science Committee developed a plan in 2015, and we're just doing a mid-year update or a mid-review. That plan goes to 2025. It has some really important components, but the most important thing, and let's always remember, this is not a trade-off. We start with a healthy ocean, science to inform healthy oceans. And then we talk about the values that we want from healthy oceans, and that's what science is trying to do. It's a hard navigation. It also recognises, this mid-year report, that these are tricky and wicked science problems. They are not simple things. If they'd have been simple, we would have done them a long time ago. The plan is very, very critical on the fact that we have to communicate really well. We can't be scientists by ourselves. We have to be a community of practice. And more importantly, every citizen on Australia's planet needs to be thinking about their role. So there's a really big part about community in the plan. The plan has these 4 platforms around science and science capacity, around government, around community, and finally around the need to make sure that we actually have vibrant industries. Now, I always use the word industry with a big quote mark on it, because there's many, many different types of industries out there. There's people who just want to look at the ocean and feel happy. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a great industry. There's people who want to eat seafood, people who want to go and do marine tourism, lots of different things. So there's lots of different things people want from oceans. And we must remember oceans are connected to our land. We start in the catchment and we end up in a very, very deep trench somewhere that many of us will never get to. But it's really important to understand that these oceans are connected. So we're really keen to work on this. I want to finish on 2 really key points in our national science. One is that citizen science and Indigenous cultural awareness are the same thing. We have 40, 50,000 years of Indigenous knowledge, which is effectively science. And communities can be part of that science. So we need to embrace a broader definition about how we do science. And the second thing is, do not kid yourself that we are in a wicked, really difficult problem. The oceans right now are incredibly vulnerable. Some of most have heard a news release about the Great Barrier Reef today. The oceans are incredibly vulnerable. So while we talk about 2025 and 2030, we really need to start acting now. And one of the things that we need to do as part of the science community, and we've got it front and centre, is science for decision making. Because science needs to inform not government, but also general citizens, people out there who want to make informed choices about what they can do. And so the plan is an incredibly comprehensive plan. And for the first time between Russell and the new, oh, your plan's gone, and what the strategy now says, we now have the links, the paths. Thanks, Tony.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Can I just stick with you for a minute? Because one of the, I guess, the bylines for the UN Decade of the Ocean is the science we need for the ocean that we want. And I think really in recognition of the fact that, you know, in order to have a healthy and sustainable ocean, and for everybody globally to get what they need from the ocean, and that touches a little bit on your commentary, but as well as what Russell said. A healthy ocean means different things to different people. It's livelihoods to many people. It's food security to many people. It's recreational fishing or just walking along the beach to many people. So just tying it back to the ambition of the decade, can you just perhaps touch a little bit more on the original plan for the National Marine Science Committee was very blue economy focused. In a sense, it was a little bit ahead of its time in the context of some of the discussions now. So how has that progressed since the plan was originally established?
There's so many examples. One of my favourite things that came out when we were developing the original plan back in 25, and we actually did it at the Academy, up in the big building on the hill, there's a big debate about this thing called restorative ecology, you know, and we should do things. And people like Peter Steinberg was saying, you know, we need to get more, and G. Chapman was saying, you got to do this. You know, it's so pleasing now to see so many community-based habitat improvement programs, from replanting seagrass, recovering our oyster reefs. So there have been some really things where people have been enabled to do it because there's good science to inform them. And then on top of that, we've had some amazing new infrastructure. Now, I'm a great supporter of our Integrated Marine Observing System and the Investigator, so they are two new amazing capabilities that we've got. We do need to keep building on our ability to produce baselines and monitoring, because it only works if we have actually got data and we can monitor the right things to inform those decision making. And so if the National Marine Science Plan only delivers on just those two things, I would call it a success. But I would say we're going to do a lot more than that.
Yeah. Terrific. Russell, can I bring you back in? There's a very common theme here, and not at all surprising, around sustainability. You talked in your opening remarks around the commitment to 100% sustainable through the high-level panel and the heads of state that have made those commitments. Can you perhaps, you know, you've been very close to those conversations and all of the deliberations and negotiations around that. In a sense, it's a remarkable achievement, I would say, that you've got now 14 heads of state who are saying that they commit to managing 100% of their marine estate sustainably. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that process, and perhaps tie in with this question as well around the importance of data and monitoring and having baselines, but also very closely tied to that, the importance of transparency and accountability that's going to go with keeping countries honest who've made those commitments?
Sure. Thanks, Tony, and thanks, Patrick, for your comments. Look, I should say last week, I understand President Macron has been invited and has joined the panel as well, so it's now 15 countries. and France, I think, has the world's largest economic zone. So the point about the 100% managed is that, what did Keating say? In the race for life, always back self-interest. At least you know it's trying. The thing about that is that manage your own ocean to a high standard and sustainably. And Australia has some terrific runs on the board through brilliant organisations like the FRDC, Patrick. But I will say that if you take all the countries that are in the panel and add up their exclusive economic zones, it's somewhere around a third of the ocean economic zones. It's a very large area. I haven't calculated it for including France. But so the idea is that you work at home and you work also with your neighbours and your region. In the course of developing the transformations, we convene meetings with our colleagues from Japan, Indonesia, Fiji, and in Australia. And so we're building in a diversity of ways that you could manage for sustainability. Look, the kind of best thing to maybe give some examples. The need to reduce emissions was a centrepiece in the run-up to the UN summit. And it turned out that a report was commissioned called The Ocean as a Solution, Not the Victim of Climate Change. And so there is a lot we can be doing to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by attending to, say, decarbonising shipping, to nature-based solutions that sequester carbon rather than release it to the atmosphere, such as the restoration work that Patrick mentioned. And I think it's great that HSBC actually initiated the first blue bond in New South Wales with restoration projects through the Nature Conservancy. So hats off to that partnership. Emissions by decarbonising shipping, I mentioned. There's been a real blossoming in the last 18 months of offshore renewable energy globally. And I think there are projects under consideration in Australia as well. So reducing the intensity of emissions, both on the production of generation of energy and its consumption. It's important to see both sides of that, and whether it's on land or in the sea for that matter. So protecting areas at risk through a threat and risk approach. Hats off to New South Wales for their work on threat and risk assessments, and it's evidence-based. It's not ideologically driven. It's what are the values of the system on the coasts, in the coastal waters, what are the threats to those, what are the solutions and actions that can be taken, and then how, and can you measure progress and loop back? And I think, Tony, I think it is important to look for indicators of success and progress in all of these. So the list is much longer than I can speak about here, but food, energy, transport and trade, of which Australia is probably the biggest port state in the world. We're a tiny flag state. We've got about this many ships, but and tourism is phenomenally important, and we hope we'll see a resurgence of tourism once travel opens up. So there's a broad spread of things to, and the thing I would say about the science underpinning these is that it really has come home to me since working over the years with people like CSIRO and the National Marine Science Committee over many years, is that the issue isn't sort of the science on its own, it's science for solutions. The scientists as partners in helping to define the problems and discover them, and then to solve them in partnership with industry, with the community, with our Indigenous Australians, sea country, and with our international partners. So I think my message would be look for the partnerships, because science on its own is not enough. We need the collaboration and partnerships, and the transformation document acknowledges the decade of ocean science as building not just the science, but building the skills and literacy across all of those ocean estates for better management. So more science, more partnerships, and more problem focus, and transformative science. The fourth industrial revolution, the AI analysis of 3D remote sensing underwater for targeting and minimising impacts of fishing, for instance. New ways of non-fed aquaculture, mollusks, kelp. There's so many opportunities, we could fill a book. So I'm looking forward to the work of the Ocean Decade, Tony, and hand back to you.
Yeah, it's thanks, Russell. It's a topic for another conversation, but I'd love to know through your discussions with government how we might progress the idea that government funding might also be outcomes focused. It would require a paradigm shift in the way we approach investments into solutions that protect the ocean, but also potentially into help make nature a little more investable, and ultimately ensure that we're getting the right level of private capital into these same kinds of projects. Tayana, can I come back to you? One of the things that Russell said at the beginning there was, the importance of engaging with different jurisdictions who have skin in the game, effectively. And I know that through your consultations, you did a lot of work with the states as well as the Commonwealth. Can you just step us through some of that process and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is that different knowledge perspectives and indeed the environment don't really care about jurisdictional boundaries or EEZs or waterways to coasts to oceans. It's all treated as a holistic part of the world in which we live in. Of course, though, we know when we want to leverage government leadership and investment and efficacy in implementing sustainability, we have to think about those different jurisdictional arrangements in Australia, which are complex. We have our federal government, state governments and local governments. And when we're thinking about waterways, coasts and oceans, those three levels of government cut across all three of those areas in a very delineated way. So to get groups of people in a room to agree to a vision and a roadmap to implement that vision, as we did in our strategy, in the Sustainable Oceans and Coast Strategy, where we propose this idea of Australia's blue ribbon as the all-encompassing idea for waterways to coasts, and two pillars underneath that as resilient coastal communities and a decarbonised blue economy coming in to bring to life this idea of the blue ribbon. It was really hard because there are institutional dynamics that play out differently in different places. There are individual dynamics that change over time. It's part of the reason why our strategy is a living document, so that we can try and anticipate those changes and adapt to them. But ultimately, one of the recommendations, in fact, in our strategy is this idea of collaborative governance, and it weaves through First Nations and First Peoples leadership in a way that is trying to be holistic and all-encompassing, but also recognises the role of the federal government in particular to play that national leadership role. One of the action items is a recommendation for a national agency. There was a National Oceans Office way back when, we know. We think that perhaps time has moved on and the urgency of the rapid and cascading changes that we are experiencing in our environment and economies and social systems might mean, or we're going to push very hard, in fact, to make the case that there can be a national agency that can consider waterways, coasts and oceans, not that we want to separate them, but can consider all of those things and consider economic, social, cultural, environmental sustainability as part of that.
So it'll be interesting to have a conversation about how we engage people in the room in that discussion. As somebody who comes to Canberra on a regular basis to talk oceans, it is always a matter of picking your way through the departments to figure out who in this department or that department or another department is the touch point for the ocean. So
absolutely.
And I know Patrick is going on to...
I think I'm looking at you, Russell. But if there's one first step, it's not sexy, but governance is absolutely critical. If we had one thing we needed to get done really, really quickly, and we can make a social democracy about this, we don't have to have the traditional, something. This is critical, this governance issue.
Can I just put it out there that I think it should be hosted in PMO's, Prime Minister and Cabinet's department, and that will just cut away all of the siloing. I was going to say a different word, but I should not because this is live. But I think this is serious, and there are huge opportunities for Australia if we get this right.
And there are, and I think perhaps more than has been the case for a number of years now, we do have oceans as a priority right up into the most senior levels of government. So the time for us to be really thinking about it is now. I'm getting the wrap up. So just as a final question to each of you, I know we've got a panel coming up after us that's really going to be looking at the UN decade and how we bring all of the different stakeholders together and what success would look like. Just based on this conversation, starting with you, Tiana, what does success look like going forward? And in particular, how do we take these three amazing pieces of work and really leverage them, make sure that we're absolutely taking the best advantage of all of the hard work that's gone into them to really set the decade up for success here in Australia?
That is a huge question. For me, success ultimately looks like this room holding space and making room for and listening to First Peoples' knowledge and their science, because they don't have boundaries or silos or this sort of weird archaic relationship to the planet. It's just one whole thing. And if we can do that, then I think everything else will be answered. The three strategies will be seen as together.
Great, thank you. Patrick?
So from a science community, I would just hope that all the young people who are out there who are thinking about a science career or a communication career see science is just the great place to be in the marine community, and we embrace so many different technologies. You can be anybody, robotics, anything these days. And if we can just tell the message, you can do anything in the marine community and come and be part of our science community, just be great.
Yeah, great call. And Russell, final word to you from Queensland.
Thanks. Look, building on that theme, I think getting this consensus is very important, and there are multiple sets of ideas. It's amazing how much they overlap. And for me, success looks like working together on clear goals, successive steps of action, so you see progress on a range of sectors and cross-sectoral issues. And Heidi Tangaroa will kill me if I don't say we've got to fix the plastic problem. Yes. Heidi. And so, I think circular economy is a great idea. There's so many opportunities for us. We need to really focus down and celebrate what we have now, celebrate how we can work better to improve the things where we can make progress on this sustainable ocean economy and look after people and culture. And I just think take a positive attitude, but be action-oriented, and take the first steps this afternoon, not by 2025.
Yeah,
thanks,
absolutely. That's a great note to end on. So please thank me in joining Tiana O'Donnell, Patrick, and Russell Reichelt. Patrick Holmes and Russell Reichelt.
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for coming. My name is Kim Picard, and I work at Geoscience Australia. I want to thank Graham and the team at Questacon as well, and everyone, the panelists, for joining us. This panel is about, we first talked about what success would look like. That was last time, 3 months ago. And now this time we'll talk about how do we measure, how do we get there with this panel here. Lucy has kindly accepted to be our, I was going to say CEO, well, I meant facilitator for this panel again. Lucy Baxton is from the University of Technology in Sydney. She is the Industry Engagement Manager for the Climate Change Cluster, known also as C3. So without any further ado, I'll leave Lucy to this panel.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us and for that fantastic interview earlier in the session. So in this part of today, we're joined by a fantastic panel where we're going to explore some themes around measurement and measurement of success. So we today live in an information-rich world. We have data at our fingertips from across disciplines and also across industry sectors. But sometimes that can be quite overwhelming. How do we access information? How do we speak it? How do we share it? And how do we understand it? Where are the gaps? It's also helpful to understand that metrics and measurements are continually evolving. We are not here to provide definitive answers around what we should or could measure during the ocean decade, but rather this panel seeks to discuss, listen, and understand different perspectives from different stakeholders. What does success look like? And where is value attributed? What considerations should we take in mind when considering information and measurement during the ocean decade? In 10 years' time, how will we measure success for a sustainable future? On today's panel, we're joined by diverse audiences, and together we're going to delve into some of these topics. So I'd like to introduce Nick Chiarelli, CEO and founder for the Ocean Impact Organisation, Lizzie Wellborn, professional iron woman and marine science student, Susanna Elliott, CEO for the Australian Science Media Centre, and online we're joined by Joe Morrison, Group Chief Executive Officer for the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, and Rhys McLeod, an economist with the IDEA Group. Okay, so to start off, and to ask the panel to set the scene from your area, we'd like to learn a little bit more about where you're coming from. So we've been broadly asked about how we could measure success. At a high level, I'd love to understand each of your perspectives on this before we get into more specifics. Nick, what are your thoughts on how we might measure success?
Sure. Well, it probably helps to tell people a little bit about Ocean Impact Organisation. We exist to support and accelerate early stage ventures that can improve ocean health. So think businesses and startups that can improve ocean health but also achieve competitive financial returns. So not one at the expense of the other. And the thinking around this actually came via reading the National Marine Science Plan. So I was reading through that a few years ago, and there was a very sort of small section that spoke about early stage innovation and technology and being important in the mix in terms of how we address some of the 7 grand challenges. But it didn't really go too much further than that in terms of talking about how we aggregate founders to the challenges, how we give them the science and the business support that these passionate founders might need. So that was my first inkling that there was a gap in the market, particularly in Australia, for an organisation that could be that representative and leverage. I think Patrick on the earlier panel talked about the fantastic network of marine science organisations that we have in Australia. We want to tap into those and provide passionate founders that have great ideas and fantastic entrepreneurial skills with access to science and research as well, because we think there's not enough time for them to go about doing that themselves. And it was interesting when I had my first conversation with Peter Steinberg actually when he was still at Sims as a CEO there, and I naively went into his office one day and suggested to him that I had this idea to provide founders and early stage ventures with access to science, and could he help that? And I'd only been looking at it from one side of the coin. He immediately said to me, well, yes, we could do that, but wouldn't that also give research and scientists access to entrepreneurial skills? And could we not look to increase rates of marine commercialisation at the same time? And at that moment I realised that we had the idea, we had the start of an idea that we could take somewhere. So for us, it's all about ultimately moving dollars, because every dollar that we can move into ocean impact and things that improve ocean health is also a dollar that's out of the status quo investment. And so all of our metrics, if you like, for success over the next 5 to 10 years ultimately revolve around moving money, but with a series of leading indicators, or what we call ecosystem metrics. So being the only organisation in Australia that we think that looks at the space like this, we're primarily interested in the next 3, 4, 5 years on a lot of leading metrics, number of founders, number of corporate partners, pool of investors that are interested in this space, and making sure that all these different ecosystem components get to what we consider to be a critical mass, so that ultimately we can get to a point where mainstream investors are looking at this space and saying, wow, that's something that I can get a return from, and it's something that I can feel great about investing in.
Fantastic, and looking forward to delving into some of those topics a little bit more about collaboration, timelines and indicators. Thank you. Lizzie, I'm going to bring you in. What would success look like for you at a high level?
So just to give some more perspective, I feel honoured to represent youth on this panel discussion and what the next or the younger generation want to see from a decade dedicated to ocean science. And when Jazz asked me that question for the first time, the first thing that came to my mind was that I want my kids to be able to enjoy the ocean like I've been able to enjoy the ocean today. One of my greatest fears is that won't be able to happen in this current environment. So a decade of ocean science to me would be like, there would be a safety net knowing that we will have this ocean for years and decades to come. But in terms of the youth, I think like my perspective today is a lot about what changes we can make on an individual level, and especially from my generation. And success to me would be knowing exactly what changes we can make on an individual level to know that we are contributing to a safe ocean, because I think in today's environment, no one really knows what the right decision is, and that's on like a consumer level and in our daily lives. So to understand clearly what the right choice is and motivating people to make that choice and to have a measurement of that would be successful in my mind.
Yeah, fantastic, really powerful, particularly about those timelines there as well. Thank you. Joe, I'd like to turn to you now and understand a little bit more about where you're coming from on this topic and your perspectives at that high level, please.
Yeah, thanks. First, I just want to acknowledge country. I'm calling in from the lands of Warrawong in Victoria. But I'm here, wherein the CEO had a Standards D Corporation, which is a Commonwealth body that was established in response to the High Court's Mabo decision dealing with the doctrine of terra nullius. And it's really important, I think, in the context of the discussion that many people think about Indigenous connection to the land, and not so much with the marine environment and the ocean. And at a very high level, I think it's really important to understand that Indigenous people, both here and also in neighbouring countries throughout the Pacific, have very deep connections to the ocean. So it's very important to consider the future of that and that interconnectedness. Indigenous people don't see marine and terrestrial environments as being separate, but rather one continuum. And that's a very different worldview, I think, from where most people come from, notwithstanding the fact that there's a long-standing history. I'm reminded that Australia's first international trade was between the Macassan fishermen and Aboriginal people in Northern Australia 500 years prior to the British arriving here. So there's a deep sense of connection, I think, between people. So first thing, when we talk about success, is really understanding that Indigenous people have got a lot to offer in any sort of future of whether it's the terrestrial environment, but here we're talking about oceans. Very important, both from a fundamentally pragmatic view. And I note that various speakers have already spoken about First Nations inclusiveness around traditional knowledge. But some of the factors that I think that are important are really to sort of mention, firstly the responsibilities of Indigenous people, and in fact nations have got to Indigenous people. First, rights and access to land. We know that there is a significant closing the gap target with respect to Indigenous recognition through native title and other settlements, including in First Nations perspectives into decision making is also critically important, and also understanding that First Nations people's outcomes may appear to be slightly different to Western Orthodox views of what are values, what is connection, and how economies could be grown from the marine and ocean environments. Another point to raise is the design and implementation of research in relation to developing strategies. Economies align with cultural obligations to country, and what's been alluded to already is the traditional knowledge, but also language of the seas that Indigenous people have, and law and customs, and importantly, Indigenous governance systems are a little bit different to Western Orthodox systems as well. Resource utilisation, and very important, I think, from a national sort of maturing point of view, is the education of the general population, as well as obviously Indigenous people, to bring different knowledge sets of education together so people understand that when we think about the environment, that we're not just thinking about it through the lens of one particular point of view, that we are thinking about it in a highly complex way. Obviously, Indigenous people, I know I've spent most of my time in Northern Australia, think about the environment as part of them, as not separate to people. And I think that's a very important point to make here at a very high level, is that oceans and the marine environment are not separate to people, that when we think about caring for that, we think about caring for ourselves as well.
Fantastic points.
So they're my high level points.
Thank you. Fantastic points, and really look forward to exploring those again with you in more detail. Rhys, over to you. Broadly speaking, you join us from with the economist standpoint. So high-level thoughts on what success might look like in your perspective, please.
Thanks, Lucy. A real pleasure to be here today to talk about measuring success in the ocean decade. I just wanted to start by saying that it's great to have such an interesting and diverse panel here today. And I'm quite surprised to have got an invitation, given we know how boring accountants can be. So I think today, I'd just like to begin this discussion by talking about the economy and the role of accounting in the economy. And I'll just park this image here for a bit, and I'll come back to it at the end. But we see the economy. We can see the economy from two perspectives. We can see it from a micro perspective, and also a macro perspective. And at the micro level, we have different buyers and sellers coming together to exchange goods and services. And we like to study how consumer tastes and preferences affect the purchasing decisions of different consumers. So, for example, if I think about myself, and I think about the fact that I want my children and my future generations to enjoy the same benefits that I do from nature, then I've been purchasing sustainably sourced fish. At the macro level, we start to think about the sum of all the different transactions that go on at the micro level. So we think about the size of the economy as a whole, and how the different industries are performing in the economy. So we can think about things like agriculture, the fisheries sector. We can also think about things like manufacturing and mining. What's important at the macro level is that the government sets policy around taxation, and also there's interest rate policy, and that affects the way that the economy operates. So the role of accounting is really not that different across both the micro and macro economy. What it's trying to achieve is it's trying to produce information that can be used by the different decision makers, that being households, businesses, and government, to make decisions. So if you think about the consumer, it might be using information on sustainability to source sustainable products. If you think about the government, It might be using information on the quality of ecosystems to prioritise restoration actions. And you think about businesses, it might be wanting to understand the risks associated with climate change and how they might affect the operations. So historically, what we know about accounting is that the information set has been very good across financial and economic angles. What's perhaps has been lacking is very good, detailed information on the environment. So at this point in time, we've been unable to link the environment effectively to economic and financial side of things. So what I'd like to see probably at the end of this decade is economic information that's linked to environmental information, enabling decision makers to make financial decisions that also consider the environment. So then if we quickly look at this slide here, the image here, the environment's so complex, and we can see seagrass ecosystems, so we can see rocky reefs, we can see different fish species, and that's the environmental side. But then we can also see the human use side, so we can see commercial fisheries, we can see cruise ships, we can see whale watching. And what we really want to try and do is be able to tell a story about the underlying asset base in terms of the environment, the health of that environment, and how that's contributing to the economy. Because we know that we are only going to continue to get the benefits that we receive as people if we protect, restore and preserve the environment.
Fantastic. Reece, well done on explaining some very, very complex issues there in such a concise way. Thank you for that broad brushstroke perspectives. Susanna, over to you. Could you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from on this topic?
So I'm a generalist. I'm probably the only person here who doesn't know that much about the oceans. So the Science Media Centre is an organisation that works between the scientific community and the news media. And so our interest is in continuously trying to get the evidence base across to the public, utilising mainstream media but also social media channels. So we're always seeing things from the point of view of opportunity. We're very opportunistic. Where are the opportunities to get evidence-based science to the public on really important topics? So we'll do things like, unashamedly, we'll jump on a bushfire or a storm, just about anything where the public's interest is piqued. And that's when we will try and get more science out to the public through the media, because that's when people want to know. So we're looking for opportunities when people actually want to know this stuff. That's when you try and get it out to them. In terms of what success looks like, there's just so many ways you could look at this. One of the things that really occurred to me is that we may not have the right kind of baseline information that we need in terms of the public's understanding and attitudes about the ocean. So we often come at this from a point of view of being scientists and pushing our science out. But I think we need to really start from the point of view of what is the public's interest and what's the public's understanding. And for us to actually measure success in 10 years, we actually need to be able to say, well, this is the current level of understanding and interest that we have out there, and this is what we need to do to change that. This is what people are interested in, and these are some of the techniques we can use. But without that baseline, it's actually quite difficult to measure success. So that's just and I mean, ultimately, what I would like to see is that there's one of the things that's really interesting is that there is a high level of trust in science and scientists, and we saw that with COVID. There isn't so much trust in a lot of other institutions, including governments and industry and various other players, but the trust in science and scientists is very high. So if we can ensure that we translate that into actual public understanding, so they trust the scientists, but are they actually getting the right information? And if we can make sure that that trust is then actually translated into good quality information that the public is receiving, that will then change behaviours, then obviously that's a huge measure of success.
Jo, you spoke about measurement and value, which could be termed measurement versus value. The Land and Sea Council uses priority outcomes and progress indicators to measure performance. Be really interested to understand if you could please help us to understand the attribution of measurement versus value in those experiences.
Yeah, so firstly, I mean, the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation measures things at a macro level, which is obviously very useful from a national level, but there are many things going on at a local and or regional level with Indigenous peoples and groups that are, obviously still finding their way through the myriad ways in which they can bring both the sort of Western constructs of measurement and what needs to be measured, but also bringing the social and the cultural together. And there's no, silver bullet in that. But in terms of how the ILC measures things, I mean, we have an emphasis on language as well, so making sure that people understand, and this goes for the ILC as well, making sure that we understand what we're measuring, that we're not just measuring things for the sake of measurement, but we're also measuring things that are going to have a deep impact for First Nations people. Impact measurement, it requires impact changing with the exception of objective measurements of physical aspects of sea country. To measure this requires an evaluation framework as well. So developing these evaluation frameworks is also part of the work that we're embarking on, both within the ILC, but I also know that many local groups are doing that as well. I also note that the Australian Government's Productivity Commission has also got an Indigenous evaluation strategy, which is very applicable for measuring our impact in relation to conservation, management and development of marine and ocean environments as well. So without sort of thinking about specific sort of targets or anything like that, obviously, the one target that we do know of that we are measuring as part of the National Closing the Gap initiative is a target of 15% being in the native title system on an annual basis. That is, native title claims are lodged in the marine environment at a rate of 15%. So that's one way of measuring impact. But I think when it comes to those sorts of things, it's really important to understand what the framework is going to be post-determination. That is, when people get their rights recognised and they actively start managing these environments, what sort of framework will be in place. And that's still obviously a work in progress when it comes to localised Indigenous groups. Some are very formed, such as along the Great Barrier Reef. There's many things going on, and also in Northern Australia, but in other parts of the country, it's still in its formative stages.
Rhys, I'm going to turn to you now. Joe's talked about frameworks there, and for the audience here, I was wondering if you might be able to explain a little bit more about the origins of the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounts framework, otherwise known as SEE. Why are these frameworks relevant, and what is your advice of how we can interpret them and apply them?
No worries. So first I want to provide a bit more context as to why the system of environmental economic accounting came to be today. So earlier on I spoke about the macroeconomy and talking about measures of the size and the health of the economy. So we've been doing that at the national level for 70 to 80 years. We have a national accounting system which measures the size and the health of the economy. And this information is really useful for governments and policymakers in setting taxation levels around taxation and also interest rates. But there was a major shortcoming, I guess, of this national accounting system is that it never linked back these measures of the size and health of the economy back to the environment. So we didn't know whether the environment was degrading. We didn't know the direct contribution of the environment to the economy, and also we didn't know the contribution of the environment to other benefits that aren't actually recorded inside the economy. So the role of the system of environmental economic accounting came to pass in about 1993, and it was started under development in 1993, and since then it's been developed and improved, and we now have a standard which is being applied across the world by a number of pretty much all countries across the world. So what that system is trying to do is trying to understand the different environmental assets. So you can think in the ocean, you can think of a seagrass. It's trying to understand the health of that asset. So what's the condition of the seagrass ecosystem? And then what are the different benefits that the seagrass ecosystem are providing? So we could think of things like the fish that it's providing, which is then caught by the fishermen. We could think about the carbon that it's sequestering, which is then contributing to climate regulation. We can also think about the recreational benefits that we receive. So it's really about this system of environmental economic accounting is really about joining this picture from just this economic view to also include the environment. And I think it's going to be really powerful as we move forward and we're making national decisions to really understand how these economic actions are affecting the environment and the contribution of the environment to those economic benefits.
I might segue there to Nick for some comment on this. We've touched on language here, that there's a lot of different language around measurement, around metrics, a lot of different jargon that might be specific. The Ocean Impact Initiative has had great success with building partnerships across stakeholders, particularly in that investment in innovation space. How do you think we can create more common ground or understanding of each other's language to align stakeholders in order to achieve these goals?
Yeah, it's early days for that question. We're part of a global coalition of incubators and accelerators and venture capital firms that actually sprung up out of the high-level panel advisory network. And the name of that coalition is 1,000 Ocean Startups, and its ambition is really simple at the moment. It's to accelerate 1,000 ocean startups within the 10 years during the ocean decade. And if you go and look at the website, it talks about the areas of ocean health that we want to improve, but there's no metrics there that talk about it at the specific environment level. So it's very early days in terms of getting the ecosystem to a global point where we can get that critical mass that I mentioned earlier. One of the key things that the group is talking about on our agenda over the next 12 to 18 months is starting to standardise some of the terminology and moving away from investment acronyms and so forth, and being able to have that common language where we can almost start to look at the space, this ocean impact space, if you like, as an investment landscape, because there are so many terms. Now, if you look at any other area that people might be investing in, they say, right, I'm invested in property, I'm invested in health, all these different sectors. They do have very clear, defined terms, and the way that they measure things is very clear and defined. It's early days, like I said, but the ambitions are that over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we start to get to some sort of common ground, particularly at the early stage level.
Fantastic. And Susanna, in your experience, you touched on the power of storytelling and getting that cut through. How, in your experience, can we engage with science in order to create that understanding of very complex ideas from research into the wider community?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. In a former life, I used to work for an organisation based in Sweden called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which was one of the precursor organisations to Future Earth. But even just the name was impossible to talk to anyone about. And just the acronyms, and it was a real barrier, actually. The language issue is such an important one. And so when you go into a newsroom and you're talking to an editor about science, you have to change all of your language. One of the things I think that's incredibly powerful is visual communication, especially when it comes to the marine environment. And I think I was telling you about this little story where, and I won't mention which tabloid it was, but I went in to talk to an editor at a tabloid, and we were running something called Scientists in Residence, where we would embed a scientist into a newsroom. And that was a way of helping to upskill the journalists in a particular topic and also to get some really great science out to the public. And this particular editor said, "Oh, that sounds great, I'd love that. Any scientist will do, just don't give me a climate scientist. But anyone else is great." So we found a marine biologist, and we embedded this marine biologist into the newsroom for a number of weeks, and they loved this marine scientist because this marine scientist had all this beautiful vision, lots of pictures, lots of visual stuff, and they just started through this tabloid churning out all of this beautiful marine science through vision. And he was writing articles to go along with them. And then the very last article that he wrote after he'd been there a couple of weeks and everybody absolutely adored him in the newsroom was about how climate change is impacting on the marine environment. And they didn't even notice because they just loved him so much. So I think visual communication is incredibly powerful, as well as obviously learning how to talk the language of other people and seeing it from their perspective, putting yourself in their shoes.
Lizzie, I'm going to move over to you now. We've actually, off the back of Susanna's point about visuals, you, before the event today, you conducted an Instagram survey. You've got an Instagram following of over 11,000 people, and you were able to use that platform to garner some feedback from your followers. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, but particularly one of the results that came back was around how 100% of your respondents knew that humans had a negative impact on the ocean. So I was wondering if you feel that young people feel empowered to make those conscious decisions for change.
Yeah, so I think like what you're talking about, Susanna, is so interesting. And just for some clarification, unfortunately I didn't get 11,000 respondents on my survey. I got 230, which is still a lot more than what I thought, but it was all young people who are pretty much any young person I could reach of a number of ages. And as you said, 100% of them said that they knew human impact was affecting the ocean. So you could say the communication there has been very, very clear, but then 98% of them said they want to know clear ways, they want easy ways to know that they can be making a difference. They want to know what the right thing to do is. And I think that kind of alludes to that at the moment, 98% of people don't know what the right thing to do is. So I think communication of the science and then what actions have to be taken from that is a really important step to go in, especially for our generation, because when in the discussion before we were talking about all this amazing thing that's happening at a high level to change governments and all that stuff. But I feel like in the future it's either going to be the government will make change and then the people will change, or the people will change and then governments will change. But at the end of the day, everyone's going to have to make a change. So we all have to be willing to make sacrifices in our lifestyles at some point. And at the moment, I feel like my generation are very conflicted about what that choice is, because from my survey, a lot of people said that they're willing to make changes, they're willing to pay more for clothes that have a better impact on the ocean, or they're willing to sacrifice things if it has a better impact on the ocean. But then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got big businesses and advertising and social media calling at us to live these luscious lifestyles that don't have a good impact on the ocean. So we're really torn between what the right decision is. So I think more I don't know what the solution is from there, but we're in a really tricky situation to make those important changes that are going to happen at one point.
Thank you. Jo, you touched on interconnectedness in some of your early remarks and the intrinsic links between land and water, both in management, practice, and also measurement. Could you tell us a little bit more about the complexities or opportunities in managing this and our understanding of measurement in land and sea?
Yeah, the connection question is something that is quite difficult to articulate. Effectively, And having worked in Northern Australia, for 30 years with Indigenous people, it doesn't really matter if you're talking about the land or freshwater systems or saltwater or sea country as being referred to in much of Northern Australia as being the marine and coastal environments out to the oceans. People have always seen that as one continuum with definitive descriptions that relate to places where people frequently go versus where people don't frequently go. And so when we talk about the environment or the land or the marine environments and people, it's always been articulated that those two or three things are entwined in the way that they're not separated. For example, land and water titles are under normal statutory arrangements here in Australia. Those two things are interacting. For example, groundwater interacts with surface water and so forth, and that's always been the view, which makes it very difficult, I guess, in terms of trying to not just articulate that interconnection, but also to get science to appreciate that connection as well. And there has been some good work done, and again, I'll point to work that's been done, at least in my experience in Northern Australia, in partnership with ranger groups, which are quite prolific right around the country now, localised community-based ranger groups working alongside researchers and others to try and articulate that and to bring a framework into place. And I guess going back to that question that you raised around the measurement and the language of measurement, when I talked about impact measurement, I was also referring to the shifts that the ILSC's gone through from a transactional approach of measuring things to more strategic and measuring things that are of value to people rather than the other way around. So cultural capital is something that's very important and measurable and how people perceive that. Social capital, economic capital and environmental capital in a framework, I guess, that brings all those four things together. And I guess this is, in my experience at least, when Indigenous people talk about that, they talk about being within country and speaking for country rather than being separated and talking about things in the abstract sense. And so I guess the first port of call really is to understand that there are different views about how people are connected to various places, and notwithstanding the fact that other people are connected here in Australia in different ways and have got a deep connection as well. I'm talking about non-Indigenous people, which is obviously respected. It's really important to think about a future of the planet, I guess, is one of a better word, but think about the future of the planet where people or humans and nature are one and the same. That if we don't look after various things, then we're not looking after ourselves. And that's, from my experience working with Indigenous people associated with the Great Barrier Reef, they think about their own health in the context of the Great Barrier Reef's health. And those two things aren't separated in the normal way. So when we're talking about measuring that, it's difficult, but it's measurable, and we've proven that. Having local groups with traditional owners with the right kind of language, and sometimes this work is done in language, not done in English. It's really important to understand the nuances associated with language and how people perceive various things within the landscape and how they are related to those various things. I'm not sure if I'm making much sense, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that the concepts that Indigenous people have about this are different, but they should not be seen as being so different as not to dilute Indigenous involvement in the design of a national framework.
Thank you. And I think that that's exactly what this whole panel is drawing out, these wonderful opportunities to listen, to learn, to understand, so that we can build real value around our measurement metrics over the decade and then integrate those into actionable frameworks. Part of this is also timeframes. I know that we are talking here about the ocean decade, but we may be perceiving this with slightly different senses of urgency or the ability to achieve outcomes within a decade. Nick, the ocean decade seeks to create national engagement within this 10 years, and as we've talked about, create actionable frameworks. What are your thoughts on the realistic timeframes for getting the metrics right in this?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge that, unfortunately, things from an environmental perspective, both ocean and terrestrial, are probably going to get worse before they get better. That being so, it's tempting to rush off and get busy doing to try and reverse that. But, and I think this forum we have here today is a good example of what we should be doing, and that's regardless of the fact of how urgent things are. We need to do things right, and we need to take the time the time needed to make sure we've got the stakeholders on board, we have a critical mass of support, and that gets the funding that we need in various areas, and it might mean that we move a little bit slower to start off with, but it's a little bit like rolling a boulder off a cliff. The first tiny little, for the first few years, you'll look at it and just work out how to try and move it that much. And then, once you do that, it can pick up steam with the right support, the right stakeholders, that critical mass.
And in the investment world, do you think that your timelines, you may be the time to reach that kind of commercial success or innovation success? Do you think that the 10 years is something that we might be able to see positive outcomes? Or as you mentioned about the funding, maybe that's the precursor?
Yeah, for us, it's still about the pool of investors that are interested, the number of startups, and the dollars of available capital. The impact that we'll see from individual early stage ventures within the next 5 to 10 years is going to be relatively small. It's not going to move the dial that we need it to within that time. It can, with the right awareness though, attract more capital, attract the eyes of incumbents to have a look at early stage technology, have a look at the pressure that consumers with their choices are putting on them as well to acquire some of that technology. And so very quickly, beyond say 10 years, you can see real impact at the environmental level. But again, we need that critical mass of dollars and support from government and all through every stakeholder group.
Fantastic. So really managing expectations, I suppose, around what we might be able to see in those 10 years and looking at what metrics might give us that ultimate positive outcome.
Leading metrics.
Leading metrics, yeah. Terrific. Lizzie, I'd be interested to understand about your views on this. We, in our conversations earlier, we spoke about how, and I think it came up in the session before, about how the ocean used to be, how we often look back with sometimes nostalgia around the beauty of the ocean before, when I was a child. How does it make you feel when you hear people saying that, and what would it, in action, would it inspire in you?
So when we were talking earlier, I gave the example. So at the moment, I look at the ocean, or like when I go into the ocean, and I always think like, far out, this is beautiful and amazing and powerful and all those great things. And then I went to a launch the other night, and Valerie Taylor was speaking, and she stood up there and she said, like, if you guys think the ocean's beautiful now, you don't know what it was like when I saw it. And that gives me a massive sense of urgency to want to fix everything that's happening in the ocean now, because if I look 10 years down the track and we're still on this trajectory, like, what is the ocean going to look like for my children's generation? Like, that thought makes me feel sick of how transformed it could be if it keeps on going downhill from here. So when I hear things like that, it makes me feel like we need to act right now. We need every level to act. And what we were also talking about when this theme came up is that often when I speak to the older generation, and not necessarily people like you guys in this room who are all very passionate about the ocean, but just people going about their daily lives, and the older generation always seem to say, I'm so sorry that we've left your generation with this problem, but like, you guys are going to do a great job at fixing it. And that makes me want to pull my hair out, because a lot of these people are still going to be on the planet for a couple of decades, and they also have a very integral role in ensuring that this change is made. Because yes, my generation are powerful, and we're going to bring change from the bottom up because we don't want to live in this degraded world, but we can't override big business and politics yet. We're not old enough for that. Like, all of that is run by the older generation. So they need to be able to accept change and want to implement change. So I think the perspective that I'm going from is that there needs to be an urgent push towards people like having an emotional connection to the ocean and really understanding that everyone needs to make change. This isn't a next generation problem. This is an everyone generation problem.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, fantastic. Susanna.
Can I just jump in too and say,
Please.
I think also, Lizzie, you've really raised an incredibly important point too, which is also about this death by normalisation. You know, this idea that at each stage of environmental degradation, we get so used to it that we don't actually realise what's happened, and therefore we see that as being the benchmark. And that's the normal, the new normal. And then we get to another one, and, you know, you wonder at what point, obviously, we reach a tipping point, and that can be then when we...
And I already feel so sad that I don't get to see the ocean that Valerie Taylor saw. I can only imagine what that would look like, and I probably will never get to see it. And that's really motivating, but it's really sad as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Can I just add something
Please,
here as well?
please,
Wouldn't it be really nice to have an accounting system that showed, you know, the degradation of our oceans over the last 50 years? Because that information is currently missing. And without a common understanding of what's going on, we can't all come to the party and really work together to develop solutions, because we're all arguing over what's happened. So if we had a common source of truth, then I reckon it would be really valuable in pushing forward.
Absolutely fantastic points. And let's not leave this topic. Suzanne, I want to come back to you about your point on baselines and normalcy. We often see media articles that focus on particular themes. Again, you touched on this in your opening comments. We as humans identify with fluffy koalas, for example, and often the media stories that come out about marine science issues might focus on those large touch points, those large animals or things like that. How can we support the communication of complex ideas? And if we don't see it in the media, is it because it's not being done? Is it because it's too difficult to explain? Or maybe it's because we think that ocean is just one big homogenous thing?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure that I have a simple answer to the question, but, you know, I think there's probably quite a few things here. One is that, again, I come back to this point that I think a lot of the time when we are communicating science, we think of it as a bit of a one-way stream. We tend to think we've got this important science and we've got to get it out to the population, whereas what we should be doing really is coming around from the population side, thinking about what people actually are interested in, what they need to know, how they can get that information. And so one of the things that we talked about was how can we actually get more science out through entertainment, for example. And this whole, you know, I had a really interesting experience the other day where my husband was opening a tin of tuna, and my daughter walked into the kitchen and said, you shouldn't be doing that. You should not be buying tuna anymore. And it was because she had just watched Seaspiracy on Netflix. Whether you hate it or love it, it has influence. And I just realised how incredibly powerful those kind of programs are in terms of getting information across to a broader public. Now, the problem is that, yeah, well, there we go. There's one of the programs that has influenced several generations already. Yeah. And actually, you know, you can get science out through these kind of shows, like Finding Nemo, Finding Dory. I know that some people will be puritanical and say, no, you can't do that, and that's terrible, you can't use animations. But actually it can be an amazingly powerful thing to do. And I think that we're far better off. So for example, take the Netflix Seaspiracy. I know that there was a lot of backlash from the scientific community. I know that there were a lot of issues with that show. But what we need to do is see that as a collaboration. So go to Netflix, go to Pixar, go to these organisations and say, okay, as scientists, we want to work with you to make sure that what comes out the other end is really, we know how powerful you are, and we want to make sure that the science is good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And Lizzie, coming back to you on this topic, because in some of the results from your survey, people were willing to make changes. They were less willing to give something up. They were okay to spend a little bit more or swap a product out, but there wasn't quite that tipping point yet. So in the context of understanding and interpreting information, How do you think we might be able to create that compelling metric so that we can nudge people over so that they either trust the information or know how to make a change?
From my perspective, it's definitely going to come from work like what you're doing, because people love digesting science information through that way, as you said. A lot of my friends watch Seaspiracy and a lot of them have given up fish since. So it's things like that that are really going to inspire our generation to make those changes, not just listening to the science. Like, I love listening to the science, but I'm probably the only one in my friends that would know how to read a scientific report. A lot of them would just find all of their information on Instagram or through movies. And I think the most important thing about those things is that it creates an emotional connection with people, so they feel inspired to make change rather than feel like they're forced to make change. So I feel like if we want people to start moving from paying a little bit more to make change to giving up things to make change, it has to be because they feel empowered to do that, not because they're being told to do it. Like, people need to have an emotional reason for making these changes.
Reece, I see you nodding. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I disagree. I agree completely. I think what Lizzie's saying is spot on. The other thing I might add is just we need to make it really easy for people to make those decisions and provide them with the right information to make those decisions. So an accounting system would help us understand, if you think about a consumer, for example, the traceability of their product. Where did it come from? What's happening in that seascape in terms of the businesses that are operating there? Are they fishing sustainably? Are the tourism operators operating sustainably too? We need some real metrics around what's happening in the ocean floor in terms of the seagrass extent. Is that decreasing or is it increasing in businesses making investments in restoring the different ecosystems? And then maybe a story around the different benefits that are being provided by that area that are being managed. So there's lots of things that we can think about, but we just need a way of clearly organising that information into a decision-ready framework which can be used by different people.
Jo, you spoke earlier about the importance of co-design and inclusivity when shaping decision-making and informing decision-making. What are some of have you got any examples or thoughts on how we can be better at creating that inclusivity in order to shape national strategy?
Yeah, I mean, first-hand experience is the development of regional marine plans in Northern Australia, which really, when you think about it, the north is managed primarily by Indigenous people living along our coastline for a number of reasons. So it was imperative that they had to be involved in the early days of the National Oceans Office, getting their heads around what a National Ocean Strategy might look like. So working with Indigenous people at various levels to be able to come together amongst themselves, but then with scientists and policymakers to not just get them to understand, but to come up with ways that could in fact be solutions. And some of those things led to better management of resources, for example, marine turtles and dugongs in Northern Australia, and therefore seagrass beds, which was mentioned earlier, and also developing the right kinds of tools for people to use to be able to track changes in their everyday work as rangers, whether that's obviously by observation, picking up things that aren't being picked up by Western scientists, and then sharing that with just an interpretation of what that means for Indigenous people and Western researchers. I think did a lot of good work. Another example that I was heavily involved in, which is more terrestrial, is around fire management in Northern Australia and the redesign or reinvigoration of traditional knowledge in fire management in Northern Australia, which led to better fire outcomes and biodiversity outcomes, but also better cultural outcomes, the development of frameworks that are implicitly relevant for people who are managing these places, bringing these different worldviews together, but also at the end of the day, it generates a carbon credit for people to sell into markets, and they're able to enter into economies that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So there's a number of examples around the country, and there's more and more of those things, I think, coming down the pipeline.
Terrific. And Nick, I'm going to go to you now, because and Reece has kind of set a little scene for this about CSR and how, in your opinion, we might be able to use that in the business industry to influence decision making.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges for us is that we are deliberately technology and industry agnostic, which means that from a funding model point of view, the opportunity to partner with one industry partner is off the table, because it wouldn't fit with this view of the world that we have to have a big partnership from a player in, say, ports and shipping, for instance. So we need to identify partners that are a level above, if you like, and agnostic, and work with us on opportunity and solution areas. Now, what that means for us is that it's about identifying corporate partners that are either already doing great stuff from a sustainability and a CSR point of view, or about to take steps down that road. And in surveying the landscape, it became obvious to us that oceans is a very underrepresented area in terms of the ASX listeds and even smaller companies with their sustainability agenda. So quite often there's social impact that's taken into account, and terrestrial environment, and climate is coming some way, but oceans is really underrepresented. So for us, every time we bring on a corporate partner, that sees us as an opportunity to partner with us to start off their journey, that's a great metric in itself. Mm-hmm. And particularly where those partners also are not just doing it from a CSR partnership point of view, but are then starting to look at the ocean in terms of their business model and their everyday decisions and the impact that those decisions have on ocean health.
And Nick, following on on this line of thought, you've helped us understand some very complex accounting standards, accounting and environmental metrics. But if we could bring it down to that business community or to a customer, how would the audience, do you think, be able to use that type of information when making a decision in the supermarket or about their superannuation, for example? How will that economic and environmental accounting filter down in order to inform us about our everyday decisions?
Or was that to me? Was that?
It was, yes. Would you like me to repeat
that, sorry.
it? Yeah. No problem.
No, I can answer that. I just wanted to touch on quickly what I think is happening in the business space right now, which is going to, really show the mood is beginning to change in terms of what businesses need to disclose. And this disclosure of information and this efficient flow of information within markets will really start to flow through to different investment decisions. Shareholders will now, want to assess the businesses they're investing in terms of their environmental performance, as will consumers. But just a couple of examples, if I may, of how the mood is beginning to change. What we're seeing is, a couple of weeks ago, at the G7, so the Global 7, where 7 of the leading countries came together, there was a discussion around businesses having to adopt the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework on reporting on climate-related exposures and risks. And there's also underway the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and they're developing a framework by 2023, which we're feeling that will also need to be implemented by businesses too. And then in the European space, there's increasing calls for businesses to adopt reporting standards around the environment and their impacts and dependency on the environment. And this is super important, not only for European businesses, but also businesses in Australia who are directly connected to the Europeans and key trading partners. So those two things are some prime examples of how we think reporting and disclosure is going to evolve very quickly, and that's going to really change the game once consumers and investors, superannuation firms and banks, they all know how these businesses are performing in terms of their environmental performance.
Exciting. Lizzie, would that help with you? Would that help you or your understanding of how to make those informed decisions and create that change behaviour?
100%. I believe that as on a consumer level, being a young consumer and part of that group, what Reece is saying is like music to my ears, because my generation needs to know what the right decision to make is to ensure that we're contributing to a better ocean. And using banks as a great example, I reckon 80% of my friends don't know the environmental impact that banks have. And if they knew, I would say a lot of them would change that. But it's just information that's so far out of our minds when we live in a world where there's so much information. Because when we talk about all of this stuff in this room, it all seems so easy and like beautiful. But then you go out into the real world and there's 100 different things coming at you every minute. So it's really hard for us, I feel, to have time to think about, oh, what's my bank doing? That's just so far out of my mind. I'm not going to think about that. So if there was measurements for that, I feel like that's the solution in my mind.
How exciting. It'd be wonderful if we talk about language, jargon, simplifying complex ideas. Maybe we can move to a world where we have a blue tick equivalent of a heart tick on products, that we can easily see a 5-star rating for the products that we're buying every day, so that it all is simplified. Would love that. So we're drawing to a close now for the panel, and I'd like to go back to each of you. We've talked a lot about how we measure, what we measure, where we attribute value, but one of the things that's clear is it's a very complex space, and complex to interpret that information in meaningful ways. So if at the end of the decade we were able to aggregate this data and interpret it, and we were able, all of us, to access some kind of a dashboard, what would be a meaningful metric for you to see on that dashboard, and why? Nick, may I start with you?
Yeah, dollars.
Dollars.
Dollars invested. And there's a twofold impact. That's dollars taken out of status quo harmful investments and dollars gone into impactful investments.
Fantastic. Lizzie?
There would be two for me. So one, there would be a measure of how close we are to an ocean that will last. So like a percentage-wise, like we're getting this close. And then on an individual level, like a way that people can know they're 100% doing the right thing for the ocean or the environment. So there's a checklist of products and businesses you can invest in or buy, and their impact, and then the right choices from there.
Fantastic. Joe, may I ask you this question? What would be on that dashboard and why?
Yeah, I guess I earlier went through a list of 10 things, and I think I'd stick with that. But obviously, breaking it down into recognition of Indigenous rights, but also involvement in management decisions, embedding of traditional knowledge, and also being able to share some of those, obviously through storytelling, which has been mentioned previously as well. So the broader national picture becomes a lot more clear in relation to Indigenous people.
Wonderful. Reece, what would be on your dashboard?
I would like to see not only information around the environment, but also information around humans, their health, mental health, physical health, also society, so the connections that we have between different people, the friendships we make and how that relates to the ocean, and then finally also the economy. So some monetary values too. And this kind of relates to what Joe was talking about earlier around the 4 different dimensions that we could measure in terms of environment, social, natural and economic.
Fantastic. Susanna, I think we've actually got a slide that might illustrate what's on your dashboard. I don't want to preempt, but what would you do?
Well, this is actually a carbon dioxide ticker, and it's been created by Matt Schriebman from Oxford University for newsrooms. So I see everything in terms of what would news use, what would a newsroom use, and whatever it is, it's got to be simple. You could create some, this is a live ticker that's constantly changing and it's interactive as well. So if you have it online, you can change the dynamics. But I think what would be really nice is to have some simple tickers like this for a few kind of indicators, like, for example, ocean acidification, assuming that we can actually get that knowledge across to society so that they actually understand what ocean acidification is, because otherwise it's going to be meaningless to them. But there could be sea level rise, there could be a number of things. And so if you think about your news segment, and at the end they have, or towards the end, there's the business segment, and they're talking about the stocks and how we're going with the stocks here, and that, you know, if you could then move to how are we going on the environment and how are fish stocks going. We've talked about other kinds of stocks, now let's talk about fish stocks. How are we going there? And if we had some simple indicators, I think that would be fantastic.
Fantastic, thank you. We will turn to some Q&A on Slido in a moment, and for those who are joining us online, you can go to Slido and the code is 099281. But before we go to Q&A, I would just like for everyone to join me in thanking our panellists for a fantastic conversation today. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to get on Slido, and just bear with me, and we will take some questions from online. Okay. Lizzie, your one for you. So with regards to the older versus younger generation, what do you think would resonate with your peers in order to drive change?
At the moment, I can see it being, change has to be not a sacrifice, it has to be an opportunity, and I know a lot of different stakeholders speak to that, because at the moment, like, as I said earlier, my generation is torn between wanting to do the right thing but then wanting to live a life like the older generation has lived. Like, we don't want to sacrifice our good experiences and live in this dying world. So like, it would be giving my generation opportunities that are sacrifices but seem like opportunities. I've kind of rambled on about that for a bit, but yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. This one is maybe for the whole panel, so just raise your hand if you want to take this one. The question is, often we seem to be speaking to the converted. How do we convert at a much faster rate, which is needed if we want to if we want the change to be seen in 10 years? Anyone got thoughts on this? Susanna?
Well, I mean, I think for me... Oh, go ahead. Is that Reece?
No, you go, Sky. Yep, you go. That's
Susanna, you go first, and then we'll
I
go
was just going to say, through a lot, popular culture would be one way, and we've obviously talked about that. Another way, apart from films, another way that could be quite powerful is through online gaming. Because I looked at the games that were underwater games, and it kind of horrified me that one of the most popular ones was one where you go down and shoot marine animals. That's basically what it was all about, just blasting the octopus. So, you know, we need to get into that space and make sure that we're really involved in popular culture and not just allow it to happen.
Fantastic. So embedding really this across all platforms, not just on the news, not just in science papers, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Reece, your thoughts on this?
I'm going to give a really, economic kind of argument and say regulation. I think, I think making things mandatory disclosure, setting, targets in terms of carbon emissions and regulating business is super important. But then we need to also support the businesses in terms of disclosing that information. We need to make it easy for them to report on these things. So one common framework, one common language is super important in achieving that too.
Terrific. Did anyone else want to talk about this?
Have you seen Octonauts? That's there is positive video games for kids now around the ocean. It's It's a Netflix series, Octonauts. I watch it with my
Good.
4-year-old.
Yeah.
Every episode is probably 10 minutes long, and takes you on an adventure where they give you a real scenario around what a marine creature would face in real life. I actually learned something in most episodes, but there is video games as well where you can, help a sea creature out. And so it's super powerful.
And there's octopus. My octopus teacher too is
Yeah, fantastic.
Terrific. Okay, so a question for Nick. What are some examples of startup businesses that are good for social health?
Yeah, well, so we ran a competition last year called the Ocean Impact Pitch Fest 2020. It was the first year we ran it. We received something like 200 applications from 38 countries. And I can talk through a couple of the winners. The winner was from Sydney, called Planet Protector Packaging. And they're a really good example, actually, because when we talk about ocean impact, it's not just about things that are in and around salt water. Quite often, the impact that can be had, in our mind, in a lot of business models, is well upstream. And so these guys are based at Silverwater, and they're a packaging company, but they don't really identify themselves as a packaging company. They're a planet protector, and they take the offcuts from sheep and they turn that into almost like a felt blanket that has fantastic cooling and insulation qualities. And so to date, they've diverted something like 7 or 8 million polystyrene boxes from being produced. So a big part of their business model is replacing those fresh food delivery boxes that you see everywhere. So that's one example. A couple of the other finalists last year, there's another company, Wave Swell Energy. They've created almost, if you think of what a small ferry would look like, hollow that out and have a blowhole in the middle of it. They collect wave power as it washes under the boat. That unit has just been tapped into the grid at King Island off Tasmania. Lots and lots of great examples.
Fantastic, thank you. Another one about products and companies. Should consumers have to choose ESG-friendly products, or should regulations be in place to ensure unsustainable, unethical products aren't available? Great question. Thoughts?
It starts with consumer demand, and once that hits a tipping point, regulation follows.
So regulators, you don't think, are in a position that they will make a mandate on the environment in the first instance?
Show me a regulator that's jumped on something early before the consumers.
I agree. I think that...
You go, Lizzie, sorry.
I think it will happen faster if we all change first. I feel like obviously the change is going to have to happen at one point if climate predictions are the way that they are, but I think it can happen faster if we all change first.
Terrific. Reece?
Yeah, so in the public places pressure on the government to, change the way they're behaving as well, remove vested interests, and we can see change happen a lot quicker. So I think that public scrutiny of the government and some transparency back the other way by the government to the public will also initiate change a lot quicker.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, got another question here. What economic policy decisions could be made by our federal or state governments that would support ocean health? That's a big question. Anyone got any thoughts on maybe one or two very powerful decisions that might really kickstart the support for ocean health? Nick, you spoke about funding before and that landscape. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think funding's key to everything, and it's the nature of the funding and the decisions and the input that goes into that that's key as well. So I would encourage people at the federal government level to be looking at forums like this and making sure there's broad input from a variety of stakeholders before funding allocation decisions are made. We've heard recently around $100 million being allocated to oceans. Perhaps it's just me, but I'm not too sure who was involved in inputting into that decision. I don't know how strategic it was in terms of looking at ocean health broadly, the UN Decade of Ocean Science, and the opportunity for Australia as well to move beyond looking at the ocean as a victim and say, well, hang on a second, we can create an industry here and a sector around ocean health that can be something to hang our hat on economics-wise and, jobs and growth and all that stuff into the future.
Great. Joe, I wonder whether you, not to put you on the spot, but any thoughts on policy decisions that might be at federal or state level that you could see kick-starting ocean health?
Yeah, I mean, when there are a few already in the Indigenous space, and that's got to do with ranges and protected areas. Also, the ability for people to get involved in economics through things like the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation that I'm the CEO of. So there are some public policy positions that are useful. I think the challenge for Indigenous people here in Australia is getting the recognition and going through the native title process, which is a very cumbersome process to get through. But I agree with the other comments that there's got to be the level of change within the community to be able to affect government change and public policy change, as well as obviously having the necessary leadership within government to be able to read that and to make the changes. The other thing I always think about, given my experience working at a global level, is the need to think about ourselves as part of a global community. And we've got this, one of the largest entities in the Pacific right near us, and many of those nations are grappling with the question of sustainability, amongst other things. They don't operate in a silo exclusive to Australia, and I think it's in our interest to be thinking about our neighbours when we think about ocean sustainability very closely.
Fantastic. There's a question here that might be directed to Susanna, although it's not directed to anyone, and specifically, does the science message carried by scientists have cut through? Community engagement around natural resources is complex and an expertise in itself. So, Susanna, any thoughts on the role or the responsibility of scientists perhaps to communicate, or the way that we might be able to connect them with experts in that field, or provide more training perhaps?
Look, I think, there is a responsibility for scientists, and my experience on the whole has been that scientists are actually very keen to get their message out, quite the reverse of what a lot of people tend to think, that scientists just want to bury themselves in a hole. Most of the time they actually really want to be out there and communicating to the public. They just don't always know the avenues, and they don't always know quite how to do it. So definitely training helps. And again, I come back to this thing of, I think at the end of the day, it's collaboration. And I do think, I'm a scientist myself, or in my former life, and I know how easy it is to sort of think only in scientific terms. But we really need to start collaborating a lot more with people outside our field. So if we're working with the media, we actually need to go into the newsroom and actually work with the journalist. If we want to get into popular culture, we actually have to work with the television producers and the film producers, and not just think that everybody's going to listen to my message because they all want to know it, and that's the tendency we'd have to do, is like, okay, well, I've got this great paper in Nature, everybody's going to want to know about this because it's such a high-profile journal. Well, just get the media unit to write a press release, and that's the end of it. And we have to be a hell of a lot more proactive than that.
So to extend that line of thought then, do you think we need to help support the training in science communication, embed that in part of our undergraduate studies at universities or postgraduate? Or do you think there's a role for more science communicators that can work alongside those talented research groups in helping communication?
Look, I think all of the above. I think there's also a strong role for more specialist reporters in newsrooms. We need more science journalists. We've lost a lot of them. But definitely we need more training, and at a very early stage. at the undergraduate level. I think it's really important. And, because a lot of this communication is not just happening through mainstream media, it's happening on social media, and it happens very early because young people are communicating all the time on social media. And scientists, whether they're undergraduate or as they work their way up, they get more and more knowledge, and they have more and more opportunity to try and correct some of the misinformation that's out there, because it's quite easy to work with journalists, actually, and to work with mainstream media outlets. But a lot of this information is actually happening through social media channels. And unless you have the people who are willing to engage and actually have that knowledge and go out into the Facebooks and the Instagrams of the world and actually engage at that level, then it's very, very difficult to really get the message across and knock misinformation on its head.
I think there's a massive opportunity for science and social media, like collaboration. And the example that pops to my mind is the Black Lives Matter movement, which I've never seen so many people post about one thing in such a short amount of time. And if something similar like that could happen for ocean science, like who knows the impact that could have on people to inspire them to make change. And in today's age, social media is definitely going to inspire people to make change. So scientists definitely need to look at that as an opportunity, I think.
Terrific, thank you. Reece, I believe this might be one for you. On an entity or company level, how helpful is traditional accounting in measuring how individual companies contribute to success?
It's a pretty good question. I guess it defines how you determines and how you define success. If you think of success in terms of profit, then sure, the traditional accounting systems that exist today are pretty good at doing that. If you have other measures of success, then we need to extend our accounting system to be able to account for those things. So if success is about sustainability and making sure that future generations have access to the benefits that we do today, then today's accounting system at the business level is inadequate. It needs to be extended, it needs to include the environment, and it needs to think about how businesses are impacting on the environment.
Terrific. Nick, did you have anything to add there? I heard you. No?
Nodding? No, I was just agreeing.
Agreeing, yep. This is our last question, and Joe, it's directed to you. The ILSC has already runs on the board for First People in Ocean Health and Wealth. The example here that's given is the South Australia Pipi Company. How can we identify and amplify the opportunities of First Nations people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of this has been touched on. I mean, I think, popular culture and storytelling, those things are really powerful. And, we talked a bit about the role of Finding Nemo previously, but there's also the very popular Moana movie as well. And I think those kinds of formats, obviously not at that scale, can tell very compelling, powerful stories. And unfortunately, that's not something that I'm particularly good at, but I know that it is a deep sort of resonance with everyone in Australia that has a connection to this country. And I think finding ways in which we could articulate and amplify those kinds of things at a national but also a global audience level are only going to do more benefit in terms of us maturing as a nation, but also telling the unique spirit that's required to be able to manage and live on this place for a very long period of time going forward.
Thank you. That's it for our panel. But before we hand back to Jazz, I would just like to thank all of our panellists one more time for a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Stay there, guys. Thank you. Thank you to all the contributors and panellists today. You've added such richness to this ongoing conversation. Today we've learnt about major initiatives, frameworks, strategies and action plans for the ocean. We've heard from a range of stakeholders about measurement and the complexity of it, giving us much food for thought outside our own disciplinary or sectoral views, which we are often understandably drawn to. And I've really enjoyed the conversation about language. Can we each leave our acronyms behind, get rid of the jargon and find ways to communicate as just humans? So now you're going to close your eyes again. Go on, do it. You're lying in bed. Roll over, grab your phone. And the first thing you look at usually is the Bureau of Meteorology app, right? What's it like out there? And then you flick over and you look at the Ocean app. What is on that dashboard that you're looking at? You've just looked at temperature, wind chill factor, humidity, all of that to make some decisions about your day. What's on the Ocean app? What do you want to know? How will you know Australia's performance today, tomorrow, and compared to a year ago? Because that's what we're talking about today. You can open your eyes. We click to the next one, please, guys. So where to from here? We have traversed the what of the decade back in March, the aspiration, and started the conversation about measurement. And then we took some consultation, and that was fantastic. Thank you to everyone who contributed there. Throughout our discussion, behaviour change has been a major theme. So we'll be talking about that later this year, and also about a course for action. Importantly, your input, those online and in the room, is critical. As we've said a couple of times, we can only have this conversation if we are listening to and learning from one another across that broad spectrum of stakeholders. So we're asking you to please amplify this conversation amongst your friends, families and colleagues, and let people know that they are welcome to the discussion. It belongs to all of us, and we all owe it something. Okay? Thank you everyone for coming along. Cheers.